Welcome everybody. I have to read one announcement from the the Vermont Humanities Council. Bridgewater Historical Society is pleased to host Bill Mayers, who will be presenting Bees Besieged, a history of beekeeping. This presentation is sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council through its Speakers Bureau program. In addition to providing public talks, the council sponsors book discussion programs, a wide array of literacy programs, and other humanities events statewide. The Vermont Humanities Council seeks to engage all Vermonters in the world of ideas, foster a culture of thoughtfulness, and inspire a lifelong love of reading and learning. So, he was sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council. There is a questionnaire they like to hear people's feedback, so if you could fill that out on the way out, that'd be great help. And obviously you all signed in, so we have a head count. That's great, thank you. Now, a little bit about Bill himself. He's covered a lot of ground, raised in Texas, educated at Harvard. He's been a reporter, photographer, state legislator, high school teacher, authored or co-authored 17 books on subjects ranging from the Marine Corps to desert travel, from war memorials to Vermont humor. He has kept bees for 45 years and has been president of both the Vermont Beekeepers Association and the Eastern Apicultural Society. With several others, he's now writing a history of beekeeping in Vermont, and he lives in Burlington with his wife of 45 years, Chris Hadsell. And they have two sons. We had Chris Hadsell come down and speak about the theater curtains at the Grange over across the river. She's an authority on theater curtains in New England, and it was a very fascinating talk, but we won't talk about her, we'll introduce Bill. So thank you very much for coming.
The title is, not just Bees Besieged. That was the title of a book that I wrote 20 years ago. This is Bees and Man, Bees and Humans, from Independence to Servitude. And it starts with a quote from Jonathan Swift. Of course, you all know the author and dean. "We have rather chosen to fill our hives with honey and wax, thus furnishing mankind with the two noblest things which are sweetness and light." And then a quote from Sue Hubble, who's a beekeeper writer. "Beekeeping is farming for intellectuals." And Mahatma Gandhi, "All we need is to be industrious, not like the machine, but like the honeybee." So I'm going to put on, those of you who can read from this far, I'm going to go to the next slide about bee facts, and you can read those while I talk. I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them for yourself, but they're interesting observations about bees if it's not too small. There are over 20,000 species of bees in the world. 4,000 of them are in North America. However, only 4 of them, 4 species, are social and produce production of commercial amounts of honey. 3 in Asia and 1 in Africa, Europe. And that's the one that we're really talking about in this talk. However, we are linked with one of those Asian honeybees, which I'll talk about a little later. Well, I'll get to the reason why the honeybees, or western honeybees, they're called Apis mellifera, have spread across the globe because they've been so productive. And they are certainly the primary honeybee in the United States, of which there are maybe 2.5 million colonies. Over 50 million, you can go to the fossil picture there. Over 50 million years ago, bees split off from the wasp suborder and switched from animal to plant protein. Bees and flowers co-evolved since flowering plants needed mobile pollinators to procreate, and the bees needed the pollen. So there, the next slide about the guy climbing the outside. I like to think of there 4 ages of humans' relationship with bees, and the first one is what we can call honey hunting, and that is where the bees and humans were in some kind of rough stasis. At least the bees were in the wild, and if the honey hunters or the beekeepers or the humans wanted sweets in the 10,000 years ago, they had two sources. They had a few berries and they had honey, but they had to collect it from the bees. And the bees were protective of their honey. Not vicious, but they were protective because they'd worked long and hard to collect it to overwinter. So the first efforts of humans was to go out and find bees. And we subsequently have called that honey hunting or beelining, which was developed in the 17th, 18th century. But in this case, this is a picture from a cave in Spain. I don't know what the date was, 9,000 years ago. The beekeepers also learned that smoke, not fire, was the divine tool for those who would calm the bees and take their honey. We'll never know, of course, but it's fun to imagine innumerable scenes in forests, swamps, deserts, steppes, where Aboriginal people first dipped their fingers into the hexagonal combs and withdrew the golden sweetness of honey. Did they sit down and eat the bees, comb, brood, honey and all? Who first hit upon the idea of capturing bees and then releasing them one by one to launch a beeline to their hive? Who first failed to clean a container of honey only to come back a few days later and find that the liquid had turned into mead? As beekeepers, but by the probably, well, what would it be, 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, the Egyptians first were the ones to actually make a hive for the bees. And they first made hives out of pottery, and they were tubes about this big and about this long, and the bees would produce their brood, their young, in one end, and they would collect honey in the other end. And the Egyptians developed really quite an industry where they would put these, I mean, they had them in sedentary places, but they also would put them on boats and move up and down the Nile following the various nectar harvests. And so they build up, you could call it something of an industry of beekeeping. Then in the forests, well, in the forests of North Europe, people began. What's our next slide? Yeah, well, this is just a nice side piece of gold art in Crete. So that's 100 years ago. Crete, of course, off the Greek coast, and this is a artist's conception of a honeybee. Yep, next. Yeah, that's the Egyptians. Okay. Yeah, and in Northern Europe, people began to collect swarms, or followed the tradition of collecting swarms, but they also began to use logs and for putting out and having the bees themselves discovered, and then they would also collect the swarms that they could find, and since the bees were owned independently of land, so in other words, you could go, if you knew it was a swarm from one of your hives, you could go and collect it from someone else's property. And they developed this technique of banging on a tin pot as they walked through the village to follow the bees, and that had nothing to do with sending a message to the bees, but that was to establish that you were on the track of getting that swarm of bees, and then you could retrieve it and bring it home. According to Professor John Free, beekeeping in Central Europe got a big boost from the spread of Christianity because of the church's need for candles. Every abbey and monastery had its own apiary, and many of the peasants who worked or rented church land also kept bees and so could pay part of their yearly rent in wax. And beekeeping historian Eva Crane has written that human hive building in the northern Europe followed the usual progression, evolutionary pattern of suspended logs, then trees, and then they began to make what has become the one of the classic images of beekeeping, the skep. The straws like a hat, inverted bowl, and the use of these inverted woven straw baskets became so widespread that it is continued today to be one of the most common symbols of beekeeping. The baskets were easily made and transportable. They could be extended to accommodate the increased production of honey, the honey flow, but they were not immune to the weather. And gradually there evolved protective niches in stone walls that were called bee bowls. And you still can see those in France and some places in Switzerland and some places in Italy. So I think there are several pictures of those. And is there one of the... Yeah, this is deliberate production for selling. These are French baskets, French skeps, which they've had the bees have produced the wax and the honey, and in these serpentine, sort of looking like a coiled python, they've filled up the space. Now, what I want you to do is make sure you note the space between the combs, and I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. This is one of those elements of bee genius that a human finally figured out in the 19th century. By the early 17th century, a Spaniard, Luis Mendez de Torres, and an Englishman, Charles Butler, concluded that the head of a hive was female, not male. And even Shakespeare, who has some wonderful descriptions about beekeeping in Henry V, still thinks of the head of a hive of being a king bee. But he does have this great passage about what happens in the fall when the worker bees, all the females, decide they don't want any more freeloading males in the hive, and so they kick them out of the hive and they die. And almost all the drones are really executed. So here is Shakespeare: the sad-eyed justice with his surly hum, delivering over to executors pale the lazy yawning drone. So for the next 2.5 centuries, that is from 1600 to the middle of the 19th century, so 1850s, gifted amateurs and even some, you can't really call them professional beekeepers, but people who spent a lot of time with bees, struggled to get more control over them and also to figure out a way to collect the honey without killing the bees, because that had been the traditional method of when you, at the end of the season, they'd either use sulfur smoke or they'd shake all the bees out and then collect the honey. But they couldn't figure out how to get the honey without mainly killing the bees. And even for Charles Darwin, the bees posed an intellectual dilemma as he developed his theory of evolution. How could infertile workers successfully reproduce and flourish? And Darwin's elegant answer was that natural selection may be applied to the family as well as to the individual, and may thus gain the desired end. He came up with the idea of a hive as a superorganism. So you've got the queen on the top, then you've got, in a normal hive, maybe 300 or 400 drones, then 50 or 60,000 workers. And the drones are examples of what's called haplodiplody, which means they have no father but a grandfather. And so even though this is not a lecture in honeybee biology, you can take that one home and share that oddment of biology. So honeybees were first brought to North America in the, well, to Jamestown and then to the other colonies. And they both were put into imperfect hives. There were in the probably 8 or 10 people in Vermont, well, all across the United States, people were trying to build hives that would solve this problem of how to get the wax out or the bees out without killing the, I mean, get the honey out without killing the bees. And there were 8 or 10 Vermonters who got U.S. patents to do these hives. And as the bees swarmed, they preceded the colonization and then the movement of people, of whites, into native lands. And according to Thomas Jefferson, the Native Americans called the bee the white man's fly, because the bees would get to the indigenous people's villages before the white people did. Well, for hundreds of years, you got this challenge of how to get the honey out without killing the bees. And so it was left to a congregational minister in Philadelphia, a man named Lorenzo Langstroth, to, in effect, split the atom in beekeeping. I mean, this was something a discovery he came up with that in 10 years created a beekeeping industry. And he's taken up beekeeping as a young man, and he became increasingly riven with this idea of what's going on in that hive. And if you remember what that, where are we on the slides? Can you go forward? Okay, stop right there. Yeah. So his insight was, and he literally, apparently said this on the street, he said, "Eureka, what if you could develop a wooden frame that would mimic what goes on in a hive and have the divisions between the combs in what he said was 3/8 of an inch. He measured it. And then you could you could take the frame out with the honey and then shake the bees off, get the honey out, put the frame back in, and the bees would be okay. And this was, this is still true today. I have Langstroth hives that are based upon this principle that the bees themselves create this 3/8 inch hallway. So they can work both sides, two combs at the same time, not really bump into each other. And that's why you'll always see, if you see bees in the wild, you see bees in these skeps, you see bees in this was a version of that. And that created really the beekeeping, the honey industry, which continues today, of people being able to take large amounts of honey out of the hives, put the bees back, and continue to produce honey. So, bee space, that was his invention. Well, then that was followed within 15 or 20 years by several other inventions that have formed the basis of beekeeping today. So one was a German who fabricated a matrix for producing wax. You could melt the wax, and then he had a extruder that mimicked the 6-sided bee cells, and he could force the wax through the extruder and then print up these sheets and sell these sheets. And even today, I still buy wax sheets or plastic sheets with this embossed design of the bees themselves, and it's called foundation, and then the bees draw that out, and it makes it easier for them to start rather than trying to produce it all themselves. Then there was a Czech, a guy who was living in what's now the Czech Republic. He invented an extractor, it's like a washing machine, that where you could put these frames, spin out the wax and honey, have it go through a separator, you draw off the honey and bottle it, and that again got spread all around across the world. And Moses Quimby, a fellow from New York State, he invented a smoker. You have a, yeah, keep going. Yeah. So, and the idea of the smoker was that the smoke, early on, even before Langstroth, people realized that smoke calmed the bees. And once he started this, everyone has, I out in my car, I got a smoker, and what it does is because so much of the communication among bees is done through smell. So if you got smoke that blunts the pheromones, the smells on which the hive is directing itself, the bees do not think upon you as an intruder or a bad guy or a thief who's coming in to steal their honey or to disrupt them. And so one of the techniques you learn as a beekeeper is how much smoke to use and when. I mean, you really ought to always have some smoke, but you don't want to have too much because then that gets them angry. But this was one of the great tools that was developed in this period of time. There was another subordinate or at least an explanation for why smoke helps, and that is that when bees swarm, one of the things they do is fill themselves up with honey, and then it's harder for them to sting because they can't sort of move their body to sting, and so by giving them some smoke or too much smoke, they think it's a forest fire, and that they're going to leave that space. They're going to leave their home and go find another space. So it's like an artificial swarm. I think the first explanation is really more plausible and provable than the latter, but the latter has a certain romance to it. Now, among the flurry of mechanical advances was a heightened desire to improve the bees' genetic stock. Beekeepers now saw that there was an economic weakness to the original, what was called German black bee. It was a Apis mellifera, and with its susceptibility to disease, its nervous nature, and its aggressive traits. So Americans went in search of better bees, and they found them in Western and Eastern Europe. First in Italy, where in the 1860s we began importing what were then called, or what's still called, Apis mellifera ligustica. And those were really the workhorses of beekeeping for the last 130, 40 years. They're docile, they're productive, they get to work early, but they are susceptible to some of the diseases we now have. So people have been shifting to, at least somewhat, to other species of bees. And one of those is another one from Europe. This is called Apis mellifera carnica, and it comes from what we now know as Slovenia. And it doesn't produce as much as the Italians, but it's a little more resistant to the mites and to these parasitic mites. And it starts working a little bit earlier in the morning. And then there's some, I give you a little detour. There's another strain of bees called Russians. And Russians are bees, well, hold on, I'll get to, when I get to the mites, I'll explain the Russians, why they're important. But people talk about, have you got Russians? Have you got a hybrid Russians or Italians? So it's like, you're mixing ethnic groups as a beekeeper. Let's see. Just a little economic fact. In the 13th century, sugar was 50 times the price of honey. Today, honey is 8 times the price of sugar. So go figure. In the late 18th century, this is another factoid here, 2 Germans recognized that bees were and are important pollinators. Darwin also confirmed that pollination was vital to plant perpetuation and vigor maintenance in various species. Such discoveries, plus the planting of single varieties of crops, has led to a commensurate increase in the pollination for business in the United States, particularly after World War II. So, for example, in California, they produce 80% of the world's almonds, and that's now about 900,000 acres are in the Central Valley are almonds. And each of those acres needs 2 hives of bees to pollinate. And that means that 2/3 to 3/4 of all the bees in the United States have to go to California in January to pollinate those almonds. And so there's similar, smaller movements of pollinators. In Maine, there's about 100,000 hives that are taken for the blueberries. And then there do apples in various other places. But the real concentration is California. Well, think of all the challenges that California has, starting with water, starting with climate change, starting with agricultural pesticides, continuing with the fact that you get bees from all around the country. I mean, you're creating this huge flu clinic in California. And then those bees are taken back to their home states to mix with local bees. But it's a devil's bargain that the beekeepers, the beekeepers who do this for a living, make very little. I mean, the big ones make almost no money from honey. It's from pollination. And the value in this economy from honey for the United States is about $400 million. But the value from pollination of bees is about $30 billion. So it's about almost 60 times greater are the value of these bees. But that means putting them on trailer trucks, 500 hives at a time, and sending them from Florida to California or North Dakota to California. So it's a big business, but it's a tenuous business. I wouldn't want to be in it. Let's see, is there a slide on pollination facts? Or is it way toward the end? Let's see, can you go back? Okay. Yeah, go to the next one. I'll give you a little bit of, several of us are writing a history of beekeeping in Vermont. And beekeeping in Vermont started the way it did elsewhere in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, with people building their own little swarm catching boxes and trying to figure out how to do what Langstroth was, which is to keep the bees or keep the honey and let the bees fly away and then come back. And so starting in the 1870s, well, even more than that, there were people, as I said, people in Vermont who had patented some beehives. In 1875, Addison County formed the first beekeeping organization in the state, and we think in New England. And then subsequently, that name was changed to Champlain Valley Beekeepers Association, and then in 1886 they became the Vermont Beekeepers Association, of which we now exist. There's now the state organization, and then we have about 5 or 6 clubs. But this is a picture of, this is Addison County, and we think it's in Ferrisburg. And I've never seen so many hives anywhere in the world except in Macedonia, of all places, in one place. But this is what they used to do in California back 120 years ago. There's a lot of hives, but it meant there was a lot of forage. And Addison County was and still is, the land of milk and honey for Vermont. Okay, what's the next one? Yeah, men and women belong to this organization. You can see in the back, some of the hives are these. We don't do hives that way anymore, except very rarely, because they're a little harder to manage. But they do look like houses. They're bee houses. Okay, next. Yeah, this is the largest beekeeper in Vermont in 1890 was a guy named Dustin Manum. And he had fought in the Civil War. He was at Battle of Gettysburg. The guy on one side and the guy on the other side both got killed, but he was only wounded, and then he got out of the hospital, walked home, and he was a harness maker. And he did that again for 3 or 4 years, and then someone gave him a book by that Quimby guy, the guy who invented the bee smoker, about beekeeping. And he said, this is pretty interesting. So in 4 years, he had 150 hives, and in 10 years, he had 700 hives spread all around Addison County, all the way between Bristol and the lake. And so this is a picture of him protecting his horse when he had to go out and collect hives. But and he eventually sold all his hives, and then he went to California and raised potatoes for the last 15 years of his life. So go figure. What's the next one? Yeah, I just like this picture. I wish I knew where it was. I mean, it's probably around 1900, 1910, and so we're just going to put it in as an anonymous picture that I found in somebody's book who didn't give a credit for it either. Okay. And this is guy on the right is Enoch Tompkins, who taught agricultural beekeeping economics at UVM, and this is Sister Mary, I think, from Mount St. Mary's convent in Burlington, and she got up to 20 hives, which she worked on with full veil. This is 1962. Okay. Yeah, this is modern. This is in the middle of Steve Parisse. He was the inspector until 2011 or so, 12, and he's giving a class. We give classes 7 times a year at Burlington's Intervale. We use my hives, and Steve comes and gives one of those lectures. And we now have about 450 members in our statewide organization, and we have an undetermined number of people who have hives. You're supposed to register your hives, but some people are outlaws and say, I don't want to do this, and then there's no way the state inspector can catch them. But the problem is, it's not like being a renegade horse breeder or dairy farmer where you got fences and you know where the damage is or going to be. The bees are going to fly over an area that might be 12,000 acres, and if you've got diseased bees, you're putting other beekeepers at risk. And that's my biggest fear, is what my neighbors are doing. So you can't say good fences make good neighbors, because you don't have any fences for bees. So well, now, how many of you ever heard of the acronym CCD? Colony Collapse Disorder? Well, in 2006, there was a beekeeper in Florida who lost all of his hives, and it was a great mystery as to what had caused this. And it continues to be a great mystery, and that's why they dubbed this condition, CCD, colony collapse disorder. And there were all kinds of theories that it was new classes of pesticides, that it was mites, parasitic mites from one of these Asian honeybees, that it was climate change. There's one theory that, because one of the symptoms was that the bees, most of the bees would leave the hive, but there wouldn't be any dead bees nearby. I mean, it was just like they had disappeared. And there was someone remembered that in England 120 years ago, there was a ship out in the Atlantic called the Marie Celeste that was found floating with no crew. So they call this phenomenon the Marie Celeste syndrome. But this idea that the bees almost all go, but otherwise it looked okay. And then there was another theory that it was cell phones. Do you remember ever people that the cell phone towers were zapping the bees' navigational system, and they couldn't, once they went out to find forage, they couldn't get back? I see a nod. Okay. Well, this is a letter that a friend of mine wrote to the Washington Post. Are cell phones killing our bees? I never let my bees use cell phones. They are social insects, and I have found once I let them have cell phones, it's impossible to control their use. The charges from time overruns can bankrupt even the most efficient apiary operation. Once they learn to use them, they become dependent. They stop returning to the hive to dance and just phone in the location of their forage discoveries. Furthermore, the increased peer-to-peer communication plays havoc with traditional bee values. To heck with pheromones, they say. Chemical communication is passé compared to digital. As in many societies, the young are the early adopters, spending their time text messaging instead of doing their jobs. In the end, we observe a breakdown in hierarchy and fatally anti-royalist sentiment. This then is the cause of CCD, foolish notions of independence among the immature, the loss of authority of the elders, the breakdown of group cohesion, and the collapse of the aristocracy. So, anyway, it's a perfect storm, and there is no single cause. But I want to end on a happier note. For 15 years, well, almost 20 years, I've taught a class in beekeeping for night school at Champlain Valley Union High School, where I used to teach. And we've probably taught 800 people, 900 people. It's been great. And I always get up in the class beginning and say, this is really cool. I feel like I'm teaching, dealing legal drugs, is to try to turn you all on to beekeeping. Because in the first place, beekeeping is fascinating and humbling because we'll never learn all there is to know about them. Keeping bees is a wonderful combination of order and unpredictability. The bees live on the cusp between domestication and wildness. They live the most regimented of lives, and yet their instinct for swarming is not completely controllable or understood. Beekeeping is both a science and an art. And it can be a form of citizen science. Or, as Sue Hubble says, I said at the beginning, farming for intellectuals. That's one of the challenges of teaching the craft. There are so many different approaches that it's easy to confuse the students. Beekeepers become like lawyers. 6 beekeepers, 7 opinions. To work with bees is to use all your senses: smell, hearing, taste, touch, and sight. In addition to the fine taste of honey, I love the sweet and sour smell of nectar, curing honey, warm wax, and the burlap smoldering in my smoker, that sheet metal device with attached bellows that all beekeepers use to calm the bees. Sure, it's hard work at times. Hauling 80-pound supers is heavy lifting, but that load is in refined gold. Moreover, working with bees is working with nature, not communing with it. Perhaps that's why, that's another Sue Hubble quote. No wonder bees have been celebrated by the likes of Aristotle, Virgil, Shakespeare, Swift, Emily Dickinson, and Sylvia Plath. In their short lives, these buccaneers of buzz, as Emily Dickinson called them, perform a wonderful sequence of jobs. They clean cells, feed the young, build a comb, receive forage, groom the queen, guard the hive, and finally, in their last 2 weeks of life, gather nectar and pollen for the colony. I enjoy the praise of friends who like my honey. I love winning prizes with my honey. I delight in selling my honey, but I never forget that the bees painted the picture. I merely hung it on the wall. And the last quote is from Kirk Webster, a beekeeper in Bridport, who said, "The bees are the color, everything else is black and white." Thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I do have some honey for those of you who stayed.
We have samples. I know we have a lot of beekeepers and a bee liner in the room, and maybe you all have questions for them.
I don't know how you want. Yeah.
I have a question. How necessary are honeybees actually to pollination? I mean, I know that they're effective if you've got a lot of them, but I would think that the native bee population might come up if you had.
That's a great question, and I mean it's the right question. And
our experience is we've got cherries and apples, and they seem to do fine without them.
yeah, well, that's good. No, but the cosmic issue is, well, a cosmic issue is what's the relationship? What do honeybees do? And there is a urban legend that's been going around for 50 years. And the quote is, honeybees provide 1/3 of every bite that we eat, or every third bite we eat is provided by honeybees. Or they'll say, 1/3 of all of our food comes from honeybees. And it's not true. It's not true. It's a portion, and our lives would be thinner, and our diets would be thinner without what they do. But as a Texas beekeeper I know said, without honeybees we'd be eating potatoes and tough beef. But we'd be eating. And then you think of all the grains in the world, they're all wind pollinated, or otherwise, but they're not pollinated by insects. So I think it's important to, I'm happy to live in this crisis, or at least to be a advocate for what you're suggesting is for a broader defense of pollinators, and that it is a big tent. And we're under this big tent where there are a lot of different species of, think of bats and butterflies as well as these other species of bees. And I think at least the beekeeping world has gotten through. About 20 years ago, there was a contretemps between the non-apis species, the defenders of non-honeybee pollinators, and there was a guy who wrote a book called Forgotten Pollinators, and he would say it without even being asked, "I hate honeybees." Well, you don't have to hate honeybees to appreciate that there are other, they're all under duress. And in fact, the non-apis species are under more duress because the honeybee industry has, it's not perfect clout, but they got more clout with the pesticide makers and pesticide applicators. So, it's a roundabout way of saying, yes, I think we need them all. And no, if we lose the honeybees, yeah, we lose a big chunk of our diet, but we don't starve. But I hate to use that, but you've all heard the canary in the mine. If we did, that would certainly be a lot of dead canaries. So, does that help?
I think it helps because I think what you're saying is that they're probably not totally essential for pollination.
Well, I think no, but the business is now it's beekeeping on that scale has become its own monoculture. So it's like the monoculture of bees are going to the monoculture of almonds and the monoculture of apples and the monoculture of blueberries and the monoculture of watermelons. And they're locked in an internal embrace, and whereas there still are these other options. There was a story in the, I think, New York Times last week about use of some other pollinators like blue orchid bees being brought in. They're particularly helpful in doing alfalfa, because what happens when the bee goes into an alfalfa plant, there's a little arm with a stamen that trips, and it's like it gets hit on the back of the head, and the honeybees don't like that. But the blue orchid bees say, doesn't bother us.
You're talking about euglossine bees? Some of the tropical euglossine bees are being brought in?
Well, maybe, but these are native, and these are ones that are native to this country.
The orchid bees that I know of by that name are euglossines, which are tropical.
Huh, well, maybe I got the name wrong, but anyway. Yeah?
Oh, years ago, there was some mention of some aggressive bee that was coming up from Mexico and Central America and causing havoc to the bees in Texas, I guess. Whatever happened to that?
Well, I've actually been working with them in Central America, and you got 2 minutes?
I got the rest of the afternoon.
Okay. Well, the background is that in the 1950s there was a Brazilian entomologist who was disquieted by the low productivity of Brazilian, they really were European honeybees down in the savannah. And he went over to the Sahel in Africa and brought back some queens from that area. And he knew they were a bit more aggressive or more defensive because they got less plants to find and they want to protect them. So they turned out to be a little more aggressive. But he didn't realize that they were going to be as aggressive as they were. And then the story gets a little hazy. Either he released them, or, as he claims, they got out. But then they proceeded to spread out all across northern South America, moving about 300 miles a year, and they got to Texas. And meanwhile, they're killing a lot of livestock, some people, and because it's not that the bees themselves have more poison, they're just more of them sting. So they'll sting 300, 400, 500 times. And so God, we had Hollywood making movies, The Swarm and Killer Bees and all that stuff. And so 1990, the killer bees, Africanized bees they're called, got to Texas. And they crossed the border. And now in the city hall in Hidalgo, Texas, there's a honeybee the size of an elephant that's just right there on the town grounds in the city property. But they moved, and they've gone now covered Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. They're fortunately poetic justice. They've gotten to Hollywood, and but people have learned to deal with them for good or ill. So there's no more fruit growing in the Texas along the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, because you've got the residential development and the farmers cheek by jowl, and so their last beekeeper got out of the business 10 years ago. But on the good side, down in Mexico and Guatemala, so where these things, the wave has come through, and there was no beekeeping for 20 years, I've been working with some. I work with a group who help coffee farmers, and one of the things we're doing is teaching coffee farmers how to raise bees in order to produce honey to add to their income, because they can't make enough money out of the coffee. And so we're using this intellectual interdigitation of helping beekeepers teach these guys, because now beekeepers know how to do it. And I was even able to work with bees I did with smoke but I could work with no gloves. And so, yes, if you know how to do it, and you're willing to, deal with a little hotter suit, they can be done. But I don't think it's going to be the way in which we would get Africanized bees is someone would buy queen bees from Florida or Georgia or Alabama, where they're starting to, or Texas.
Yeah.
I'd never buy any more bees from Texas because they're all Africanized. So more than you wanted, maybe. Yeah.
I just have a question about honey. I know you remove the honey from the hive, but is there such a thing as removing too much honey? Do the bees need some of their own honey to survive?
Good question. Well, yes. If you want your bees to survive through the winter, take my case. I'm in Burlington. My rule of thumb is I have to have a hive that, if you look at the 2 boxes, woodware and the honey inside, that should weigh about 150 to 160 pounds. And I'll know at that point that I have 60 to 70 pounds of honey in the cells that the bees can then work through in the course of the winter. And if it's down at 110, then I have to feed them some more. And customarily, you feed them a 2-to-1 sugar to water solution. So if you have more than that, then you don't have to feed them. So yes, you could take. I mean, the Canadians up in Alberta for a long time, they would simply raise with 22-hour days. They could get 300 pounds out of one hive at the end of the season. They just kill the bees and then buy new bees the next year. Now, I don't think they do that anymore. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you need and what happens in the winter times, the bees will form this cluster. It's like about the size of a football, and it'll be down in the bottom box, and they'll be and the bees don't ever sleep. They're always moving a little bit, and so it might be they want to keep it at 85 degrees, right in the middle where the queen is, and then on the outside it could be minus 20. But the bees keep shifting position as they work their way up, 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 up. And so ideally what you want to do is go look at your hive on the 1st of March and just begin to see bees at the top, but still see this nice little cluster, and you'll know that you don't have to feed them for another 2 or 3 weeks. But it's never as clean as that, but that's the idea. Does that help?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
You get to understand them.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had a friend who keeps bees, and they gave us some whipped honey that the bees had whipped. I don't follow that. Could you explain how?
Yeah, there are 2 ways of doing, well, 3 ways of doing that. One is all honey crystallizes, and some honeys crystallize faster than others, like goldenrod, in which we're now living. I don't like goldenrod. I think it smells like gym socks, and it crystallizes very fast. But it's a great crop for the fall. I mean, this is what my bees are putting on the shelf to get through the winter, and I think it's going to be a really good year. I mean, it's just, but then at the other end of the spectrum, there's basswood, which is really wonderful, minty, clear, and it stays uncrystallized for quite a long while. And then in between, there's a lot of other things. But there are 2 ways in which people get. So you could just leave a jar. So these 2, this is raw honey which has been crystallizing, and you can even see it's even got kind of layers to it. This has been crystallizing without any whipping or anything. This one from Middlebury, this is their best seller. It's a creamed honey which they sell tons of it down in New York to Turks and Greeks, but it's become a real big seller where they take a barrel and they heat it to about high 90s, and then they put it in it's almost like, an old milk, doing ice cream or butter churn. And these wooden paddles go around and do it for half an hour or so, And so they create these, and then they introduce some, like sourdough. They'll introduce some, what do you call it? Starter. You know, they keep the thing going, and they get this texture, which is a bit finer than this. So that's what people call it, whipped honey. They call it creamed honey, and there's no.
The person that gave it to me said, well, the bees had whipped it, not her. And
Yeah,
it was
that's true.
It was
No, the bee.
creamier than.
Sure, if I left my honey.
Crystallizing, I understand.
Yeah, this is mine, but you see, it's starting to crystallize. But you know, I defy you to say it's bad. I mean, it's just a little bit. But you see, Americans have been taught to look and buy honey as clarity, to eat white bread, for God's sake. You know, it takes all the taste and everything out of it. So you know, you want to delight in a little bit of. And then this one, this is a style. This is again my honey, but the Greeks do this a lot. You know, they put different kinds of nuts into a jar. This was done on 1st of January. So it's been in every day. So I turn it over and soak it through, and it's great. So when you try this, make sure you get one of these pieces of nut and some honey, so that you can see how it's suffused into the nut. And if you really want to levitate with joy, just put some of the stuff on yogurt, Greek yogurt. And then this is, well, this is a little jar of French honey that I got a while. It's starting to crystallize. And who knows French? Tournesol. What's tournesol mean?
Sunflower, I think.
Huh?
Sunflower, I think.
Sunflower. Okay, well, this is sunflower honey. So you just try that. And it's old, but again, what you want to do when you're tasting this stuff, you want to get enough sticks, so you don't want to use the same stick in the same jar. But think about, you're tasting on two levels. The first level, you think, oh God, you know, where's the blueberry taste? Where's the clover taste? Where's the, you know, is that raspberry stuff? You know, don't go there. Unless somebody really proclaims that this is, that we're going to really show you the difference between this honey and basswood. You want to say, okay, if it's primarily from one nectar source, that's fine. Just enjoy it. I wish I had my little sheet I could give out, and you can. But you want to really try to taste it. See where it is on you know, this band of teeth and tongue and so forth. And then texture, because there's 3 or 4 different textures here. There's this is straight out of the hive. You know, this is so you want, when you dip into this, you want to get the wax and eat the wax as well as the honey. And don't you dare spit out the wax. You know, this is the way it was before the extractor. This is the way people ate honey. And this is untouched by human hands. And if you don't like it, you know, just keep your mouth shut. Okay? So whatever is easier, we can just pass, I just leave them up here. And the drill will be, get yourselves as many napkins as you want. Take probably 3 sticks each, because then there's going to be 6 different tastes. And the last thing I'll say about the honey is, what's the smartest dog? The smartest dog's a mongrel, right? Except the border collies, I add a border collie, that's the smartest dog. But normally, the smartest dog's a mongrel. And why? Why is that? Because the mongrel's got all that incredible genetic mix in it. Okay? So what's the best honey? The best honey is the one that's got all these different flowers in it. You know, it's just like, you know, a Rubik's Cube of flavors and stuff. And then what's the best varietal honey is mine. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you comment on the nutritional value of honey? I for some reason, I'm thinking it's mostly or all fructose?
No, it's sucrose.
It's sucrose.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's actually
Mixture.
it's sucrose and fructose, which is 80%, and then there's some other stuff. But it's a sugar. But But then once you start getting into the health properties, and people start talking about Manuka honey from New Zealand is going to cure every ailment you had, and then some you didn't even have. I mean, that's pushing the boundary. I love to argue about arthritis. You know, I don't think this is only my belief is I know very few beekeepers with arthritis. Even though I have a doctor friend, she says, "You look, you got all kinds of arthritis." I said, "But it doesn't ever hurt, so it doesn't bother me." So Charlie Mraz in Middlebury sort of made a kind of a side business, but it wasn't. He never took money for it because so then he didn't run afoul of the AMA. But he would do stings, people, and and I interviewed him a couple months before he died, and he just put out a book, and he had this silhouette of a human being, and he had the dots on people where he was doing it in odd places. I mean, you'd right on the elbows, or on the back of the hands, or on the hips, and I said, "Charlie, these look suspiciously like acupuncture marks." He says, "It's not a mistake. You know, it's the same ones. It's the same flows of energy, whatever the term of art was." And I believe it works on arthritis. I don't know about the rest of the stuff, but you know, you have to decide for yourself. I mean, you have to be able to take a little pain. So anyway, so we'll just set them up here, and you just come and help yourself, and there's no test unless you. Oh, and there's also some other goodies in the back too.
You can start with the honey and work your way back.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.